Okay, Marily. So the live stream is on. Recording is started. There are people already in waiting room. So I will be turn off my camera. I'm here. It's up to you. We'll now let the audience in, and after a couple of seconds, we can start. Is that okay? Cool.
Sounds good.
Okay, we'll let the audience in. Okay,
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good morning to our participants who are in North America and the Caribbean region. We're about to start this event. My name is Maria Maciel. I am head of digital commerce and internet policy at DiploFoundation, and I'm really pleased to be the moderator of this event today. Our discussion will be dedicated to a very important topic, as we know, standardization. So standards are well around us and they are part of our daily lives. They are the reason why we can fit our credit cards and no matter what ATM machines when we travel around the world. They make sure that the products that we buy are safe because they follow certain procedures and standards in their production process. And in the digital realm, they make sure that we can, for example, connect to the internet, that our devices are interoperable and that they can talk to each other no matter which manufacturer. We have known that standards are important for many years. Diplo, for instance, has tried to raise awareness on the importance of standards among the internet community for quite some time. But lately, we see that there is a renewed interest on standards, not only because we see that standards are being developed in the field of emerging technologies that are very important, such as artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and so forth. But we also see that there is a process of what we could call perhaps a politicization of the discussion on standards. We have more participation from other countries that were less involved before, such as China. And this is something that has raised attention on the debate around standards. We have developed a very interesting report that has been presented in an event that took place in February, which is called International Digital Standards, a case for the involvement of stakeholders in the ARIN region. This report has been developed by means of a partnership between Diplo and ARIN, and we are very happy to organize a segue of the event in which the main findings of this report were presented. This time around, our event will be focused on a very important issue, which is participation. As we know, many of the standardization processes, they are open for those who wish to join, but participation still remains low, especially in developing regions of the world, and countries are included in that. Although we have a very expressive participation from some countries in the region, more developed ones such as US and Canada, we're still lagging behind when it comes to the participation of stakeholders from other developing countries in the region. And this is the point that we would like to discuss today. And to discuss this issue, we have two very distinguished speakers. One is my colleague, Sorina Teleano. Sorina is an independent consultant, and she is the main author of the report, which I just mentioned. Before that, Sorina also was the author of another report that Diplo published together with Konrad Adenauer that analyzes the geopolitics behind standards and this increasing participation of China. I'm sure that we'll be able to drop both links to you in the course of this event so you can take a look at the report. Serena will be with us. She will cover, I'm sure, again, a few findings of this report, but she will focus on the issue of participation today. And with Serena, we also have the great pleasure to have Pavel Woodling with us. He's the Director of Caribbean Affairs in ARIN. So Pavel will be discussing from this regional perspective how we could increase participation of different actors in standards development processes, considering that standards are so important to us, not only from a technical standpoint, but also from the perspective of the politics and economics as well. So without further ado, I would like to throw a first question to our speakers. So when we look more closely at what could motivate actors to take part in the development of standards at the international level, what do you think would motivate them to participate, and which are the organizations that they could choose to focus on, considering that we have so many organizations out there that sometimes seem to be developing work on very close topics, and we see that there's some overlap. So how to make these difficult decisions if you are a developing country and you have scarce resources to follow these issues? Serena, over to you.
Thank you, Marilia, and hello, everyone. Indeed, there are so many standardization organizations at the international level that it becomes a bit difficult to decide what you want to focus on as a private company or a governmental entity or a civil society organization. And it's basically impossible to see what's happening everywhere. And that's why it's important to have some sort of alliances between entities that want to follow this work. But before getting there, going back to your first questions, what motivates actors to participate in international processes focused on the development of digital standards? And just to clarify, by digital standards, we mean standards for digital technologies. It pretty much depends on the type of actor. If we talk about the tech companies, of course, their main interests are related to the technical and economic implications of standards. And this is particularly the case for international standards. And we all know that standards foster interoperability, and they also open the doors to international markets. And of course, if a company manages to get some of its technology reflected in international standards, that would give it some sort of an advantage on the international market. And we see quite a lot of the big companies trying to push for this sort of reflection of their technologies into international standards. And this is something natural. It has been happening since technical standards started being developed. Then if we think about governmental entities, they would care, for instance, about the public policy implications of standards. For instance, standards can help improve public services, they can advance innovation and economic growth. And just recently, since we had the WTSA happening a week ago at the ITU, this is the World Telecommunications Standardization Assembly, there was a discussion, for example, about the role of technical standards in driving financial inclusion. And that was of particular interest for governmental stakeholders, especially in developing countries. And then we would also have civil society organizations. And I guess there's no surprise here that they mostly care about the human rights implications of standards and how the way in which standards are developed might impact in one way or another the respect or abuse of human rights. So that would be just a very, very general overview of what would motivate some of these actors to participate in international standardization processes. Now, on how to choose what organization to focus on, again, it depends on the actors we're talking about. For tech companies, they mostly look at the SDOs, standard developing organizations, that develop the standards for the kind of technologies they develop or sell. For instance, if you care about 5G, you would go at 3GPP, where most of the 5G standards are being developed. If you care mostly about internet protocols, you would go at IETF. But as Marilia was saying, there is quite an overlap. between the work being done by some of the key standardization organizations, because there is no such thing as a written agreement which says this organization is developing standards for this kind of technology and another organization is developing standards for another technology. So you would see overlaps, and you would also see various actors trying to find the place where their standard proposals has the most chances of being adopted. And this leads to the well-known phenomena of forum shopping. So basically trying to find the avenue that is most friendly to you as an entity to push or get your standard being approved. And one thing that is important for the actors that try to, for instance, sell their technologies at the international level is the economic implications of standards, and in particular the ones developed at the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, ISO, International Standardization Union and Organization, and IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission. As people here might know, at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, there is this agreement on technical barriers to trade, which in very general terms is strongly encouraging governments to use international standards as reference in their technical regulations. And although the agreement doesn't really say what it means by international standards, there is this general agreement that standards developed by the ITU-T, ISO, and IEC are relevant. So this is why you would see big companies who care about selling on international markets being particularly interested in these three organizations, because countries are strongly encouraged to make reference to these international standards. And I think I will stop here, and we can continue if we have questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Serena. Before I turn to Bevel, let me just reinforce a message that was sent by our chat moderator, my colleague Ginger Pak. Please forward your questions if you want through the chat. Ginger will be collecting the questions, and I will give her the floor so she can voice the questions. But if you prefer to join the conversation and ask your question via microphone or video, please feel free and encouraged to do so. We are small group, it's a cozy meeting, so please feel free to join this conversation, because after all we are talking about participation. So let's walk the talk. Bevel, over to you to reflect on the question that I proposed on Serena, and perhaps to explore this from a regional angle. What are the obstacles that you see perhaps from the regional perspective, and how to encourage these actors to participate? Are the motivations mentioned by Serena clear to the actors in the region? How would you see that, Bevel?
Thank you, Maria. And congrats. First, let me say congratulations to Diplo on putting together this research and preparing this report. I think it's very, very timely, given the important role that, as Serena said, that standards play in everyday life, sometimes so much so that persons don't realize or recognize how much of what we do and how much of the functions that we engage in are dependent on somebody, somewhere, developing and maintaining standards that allow us to interact and to interoperate in the way that we do and that we've come to take for granted in today's world. I think the question that you pose is particularly important, because there's so many factors that go into explaining why certain groups participate in standards making and why certain groups traditionally are not even present at the table. And speaking using the experience of the American Registry for Internet Numbers, which is an internet number resource management organization, and able to see into the vagaries of the larger markets in North America, but also some of the challenges that you would see in the smaller Caribbean territories. I think the juxtaposition between the developed countries and the emerging or developing countries is where we can start to find the answers to the kinds of factors that play into those who participate in it. And I have a short list, and it's not exhaustive, but it attempts to describe some of the nuance behind the participation that we see and some of the challenges that are faced. Obviously, to participate in a standards body and to participate in the process of developing standards, one has to presume a certain amount of technical competence, whatever the standard making function is. There has to be a certain level of capacity. And the smaller the economies, the smaller the societies, the greater the challenge it is to find sufficient persons with sufficient skill, competence, knowledge, and know-how to credibly contribute. Given the size of most Caribbean markets and territories, this is one of the most significant factors, I think, because it brings with it a cultural dimension, and that is a presumption that someone else, somewhere else, will take care of certain types of standards development and standards formations. And inside of that presumption, there's also an assumption that, and whatever they come up with will be the best for all of us. And I say assumption because that is not always true. One size does not fit all as far as standards making goes. And so there's some, as I said, there are some very nuanced dimensions to why we see the landscape that we see that I think is important for us to pay attention to. The other one is the other factor I think is just awareness. I've been in discussions at the public sector level where whether it is senior technocrats or ministerial persons with ministerial responsibilities, they're simply unaware of which body is responsible for what standard. There is ignorance even at the level of, is this a standard or is this something that we just always did? There is ignorance at the level of, can I actually have a say or impact or influence in how this is framed, shaped, or how it functions from a policy standpoint? And so you have this this awareness component that is tied to knowledge, that is tied to how things come to the attention of governments and how they come to the attention of the private sector, and which actors are responsible for raising that awareness or bringing that knowledge. I think it was Serena said earlier, one of the standards making bodies is the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU. And the ITU has a presence in the Caribbean, very active presence and a historic presence at that. And the Caribbean is therefore, and you can take this as causality, is therefore active in the ITU process. And the positions of and the perspectives of Caribbean territories are very vocalized in that particular forum. And when you contrast and I don't know if the report made any linkage between this, when you look at the standards bodies where the Caribbean, for example, is not present, if you ask the question, is there an active outreach to the region to create the awareness, to indicate the level of participation that would be appropriate or relevant? I think most times you'd find that the answer is no, there is not. So there's a link between presence and attention to actually going out for the different types of or more diverse expressions of stakeholder participation and those stakeholder groups participating in it that we also have to bear into account. And then the other point I would like to just put on the table is relevance to development priorities. In small markets and small economies where there is a constraint of human resource and a constraint of financial resource and the constraint of political attention, you will find persons putting energy and effort and investment into those areas where there is a clearer linkage between participation and some specific local or regional development goal. So whether it is a local priority at a national development level or it is a treaty obligation, these points to me another part of what it takes to trigger or to motivate a territory, region, or community to participate in standards making. If there is a linkage to a tangible benefit that is well understood, chances are that you'll find greater levels of participation. So I wanted to just put those on the table to kind of get the conversation going, and then we can probably pick up some more points as the discussion evolves.
Thank you very much, Bevel. I think that you provided a very good segue actually to the second question that we would like to tackle today, which are the concrete ways and policies and actions that we can actually put in place to enhance participation. I think you started by touching two very important points. One is outreach. Are there concrete, clear outreach efforts out there to bring in the actors that are not actually participating or the regions that are underrepresented? And are there clear outreach efforts that show the concrete, tangible benefits of participating? I think that this is very, very important. Sarina, perhaps you could share your views on that and tackle the second question, which are the concrete ways to participate.
Thanks, Marilia. The standard development organizations, at least the main one, theoretically, they are all aware about this standardization gap, which is basically the difference between participation of stakeholders from developed and developing countries. And they do have some measures or action plans, strategies in place trying to bridge a bit this gap. The extent to which it works or not, I guess that's for anyone to or everyone to judge, but they do try to get better at that. And at the recent WTSA in Geneva, there were 2 resolutions being modified in this direction. What actions can the ITU take to improve a bit the participation of stakeholders from developing countries, and not only governments, but also private companies? It was more in the sense of we ask member states to encourage participation of private companies, or we ask private companies from developed countries who have offices in developing countries to encourage those offices to participate in standardization. So not so much very, very concrete actions, but the fact that there was recognition at that level, I think that's a good sign, and we can hope for more outreach from the part of the SDOs themselves towards actors from the developing countries. What else can be done? In the report we published last month, we do list a set of possible actions, measures that can be taken, and we group them by category. For example, we say that regional standard development organizations, the ones in the region, and there are 2 of them, CROSC and COPANT, which include some of the countries in the region. And they can do a few things, for instance, intensify capacity development initiatives, that has already been mentioned, that would help raise a bit more awareness about why standards are important, which are the main organizations which are developing standards, what does it take to be there and contribute. And this can also be done, for instance, in cooperation with the international organizations, because these regional STOs do have some frameworks of cooperation with at least the ITU, ISO, and IC, and building on these theoretical frameworks could also result in more concrete actions. Strengthening the relations with the international STOs is another recommendations we're making, and that would basically mean following the work of these organizations closely as regional STOs, and maybe organizing, regular briefings for national STOs and other stakeholders in the region to keep them aware about what's happening at the international level and ways in which they could participate, or issues they could be paying attention to, for instance, standards developed for ICT for climate change, or anything else that might be of particular relevance for the region. And then, of course, there is also the opportunity for the regional STOs to, in some way, facilitate the coordination of common positions across the region on international standardization matters. Again, on those that really do matter for the region. We're not saying now that there should be involvement in everything and anything, because that's basically impossible for any one stakeholder. Then we also have a list of recommendations for governments in the region and national standard developing organizations. And these are quite diverse, ranging from, if possible, the allocation of more resources for participation in international STOs, and again, in particular, the 3 major ones, ISO, IEC, and ITUT. We're also saying it would be good for governments to make use of their presence in Geneva, because most of the countries from the region do have missions in Geneva, to follow the work of Geneva-based standard development organizations. And again, we are aware it's impossible to follow the work of all 3 organizations, but having some sort of cooperation mechanism in which whoever is following whatever could alert the others would help raise a bit more awareness about what's happening there. And on that note, joining efforts with other countries from the region, but maybe also from beyond, could enable a wider coverage of various activities and exchange of information. And then, of course, we do have a few recommendations for the international SDOs themselves. One is related to what I was saying earlier, partnering with national and regional SDOs to raise more awareness about the international standardization processes within the region and ways to participate and how this participation can be put in practice. Supporting the inclusion of actors less represented. And as I've said, there were a few resolutions at ITU adopted last week. One of them even suggesting the reduction of fees for participation for non-governmental actors in some of the ITUT work. And building on another comment from earlier about missions in Geneva, a recommendation for Geneva-based SDOs would be to actively reach out to the Geneva missions of this country and, tell them about the work they're doing and how they can contribute. So not just wait for countries to show or showcase their interest, but actively reach out to them. And I would stop here again and seeing if there are questions, comments from chat. Thanks, Marilia.
Thank you, Serena. I do see that we have a couple of questions that I will ask Ginger to voice. But before, I would like to make two questions actually for Bevel. We heard from Serena that we do have a concern on the international level from the side of standards development organizations. We have resolutions, but do they translate into practice on the regional, national level, or is it just a policy discourse that becomes disconnected? How to make bridges between these different levels of standardization that we are talking about, the international, regional, national one. Serena made some suggestions, but I would also like to hear from you. Can I give the floor to Ginger so she can voice the questions that have been asked? Ginger, over to you.
Well, thank you, Marilia, and in name of everyone that's participating. We're all online, of course. And I do remind you that if you raise your hand using the raise hand function, that will alert Marilia that you would like to join in. Otherwise, I'm happy to read in your comments. We have a question from Junior. Given the fact that small island developing states are challenged with limitations imposed by the economies of scale across industry and sector, what should be the primary role and focus of government and regional entities in leading the development of harmonized standards to support national and regional development? Cecilia has asked, how do you see the issue raised by non-state actors that SDOs are expanding mandates and that standards should be elaborated in the already existing and more specific standard development organizations, for instance, the IETF and others? I can turn those back to you, Marilia, for the group.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ginger, and thank you both for your questions, very interesting questions. Bevel, over to you, perhaps, to reflect a little bit on that.
Yeah, I do want to respond to the question from Junior in particular, which links to what Serena was saying earlier. One of the things I think we need to establish is that standards do matter, and there is a value to having the broadest possible participation in the standards making process. And I think it may seem obvious, but it is worth stating. The regional internet registries, there are 5 of them in the world. ARIN, the American Registry for Internet Numbers, is one that shares this Caribbean, Latin America, North America region with LATNIC, the Latin American Internet Registry. And we have seen, and there is a form of the activity of the RIRs, or the regional internet registries, that is standard settings for internet number resource policy development. And that participation requires the input of the community. And I want to use this as an example of how these points intersect. When we talk about widening participation, there has to be a specific set of steps, and acknowledgement of the value of the broadest possible participation has to trigger specific institutional changes to ensure that you get that participation. On the easy side of the change is outreach, obviously, going to the underrepresented or unrepresented regions and making a case for participation. But we've seen over the years that there's another side to that coin, and that is also making an outreach to the existing groups or stakeholders who are part of the standards formation process, and making sure that they create a space for these unusual, underrepresented or unrepresented groups to come in. And I do want to underscore the importance of doing both things at the same time. Because if you make an treatment to a region like the Caribbean, for example, that might have a lower level of participation in the standards bearing process, and then they go into a forum where there is no space or tolerance for the stage of contribution they may be able to make, it essentially shuts the door to them investing in further participation in that forum. And so I think when we talk about things like the role of government, and we look at the type of outreach that might be required, once again, it's a very nuanced approach to widening the participation field. And that approach has to incorporate things such as surveys to understand the nature of the landscape. And I think we've begun doing that with the work that you've started. Workshops to ensure there's some level of parity of understanding in terms of the groups that you're trying to bring to the table, so that they know the language, the protocols, the procedures of what participation involves. There has to be a very specific attention to building a sense of community. So that person's coming in on simply coming on the basis of technical credentials, but they're coming in on the basis of a common commitment to the greater good. The establishment of standards is for a reason, and persons participating in that normally are volunteers or in some stipended type arrangement. And so you need a certain level of commitment that comes from just wanting to do that which benefits the entire sector industry in a particular way. So forging a sense of community is also an important part of it. That is sometimes underlooked when thinking about how do you widen participation. And then, of course, these things have to be tracked. If there is a stage one where we're saying, let's make greater outreach, or let's see if we can get broader participation, there has to be some deliberate effort to ensure that there is a tracking of, are we actually reaching these groups in a relevant way? Are they actually being integrated in an appropriate fashion? Are their contributions actually feeding into the larger standards development process? And to me, all of these things, when you put them together, they really point to a very comprehensive and very collaborative approach to targeting underserved or unserved regions or groups to bring them into the process. So I wanted to put that on the table to make sure that that when we speak in terms of outreach, or we speak in terms of capacity building, we understand that there are many dimensions that have to be factored in at the same time. And then I want to add this one last point, and then I'll stop. And that is, what are the strategies for lowering the cost of participation? So COVID has changed some things for the better, some things for the worse. One of the things that it has allowed us to do is to consider what participation can look like virtually, in a way that previously standards making would have been go to some place and sit for some time and do something and then exchange documents in between. And that would have been prohibitive for smaller, economically disadvantaged regions or groups or governments. But now if we look at the issue of lowering the cost of participation, we can think of it in terms of what are the strategies for participation that will ensure a level of meaningful contribution from groups that may not, for example, be able to go places or send consistent representation to meetings. And that too becomes part of the arsenal of consideration when we're looking at a modern or contemporary strategy for broadening participation from regions like the Caribbean.
Thank you, Bevel. You make some so important and down-to-earth remarks that resound a lot with my own experience. I didn't participate in standards development organizations, but I did participate in ICANN for some years. And I remember my first experiences. ICANN has a very complete onboarding program that people really feel that they are welcomed as newcomers. However, even so, when you sit in a policy-making environment in ICANN, and I was sitting at the generic name supporting organization for 3 years. The first year, I could barely follow the discussions. There were so many acronyms, and it was so technical that it took me a year actually to be able to get the mic and say something on behalf of my constituents. And the others had patience with that. So you touched some very important points. Perhaps we need to do better with capacity building in the sense of onboarding and this welcoming experience that newcomers need to feel. Openness is not the same as participation. We are open for newcomers, but we need to create a welcoming environment and one that really makes this process of onboarding easier for everyone. So this is a very, very interesting and important point. Sarina, perhaps you could reflect a little bit in a sense of the collaboration on the regional and international level between these different actors. Sometimes it's very clear the point for the private sector, for instance, to participate, but how could we make the private sector collaborate more with governments and perhaps with civil society as well in these discussions? Sarina.
Thanks, Marilia. Before I go into that, just responding to the other question in chat from Cedric about issues raised by non-state actors that SDOs are expanding mandates and then standards should be elaborated in already existing or more specific SDOs. I guess my take would be SDOs are not really expanding their mandates. There might be some wishes from some actors that there is some extra work being done in one organization or another on issues that they might not have been particularly focused on. But as we know, or we should be knowing, SDOs work on the basis of consensus. So unless everyone agrees that a new work item should be taken up, then that doesn't happen. But we do have the forum shopping approach I was mentioning earlier. And because there is, again, no sort of agreement between SDOs about who's dealing with what, you would see one single actor going from one organization to another with their proposal, trying to get it approved, because some organizations or others might be more favorable for that specific proposal. But again, I don't think that means that the SDOs themselves have this wish of expanding their mandates or going into areas that they might have not been focusing on. And yes, there is a wish from some actors or others, but it very much depends on whether there is consensus or not around that. On the point of cooperation, I guess it takes a bit of willingness from all stakeholders, be they governments, be they private companies or civil society, to work a bit closer with each other. And that's, I was saying earlier, it is impossible for any one actor to be able to follow even the work happening in one single organization. So having some sort of alliances, partnerships, whatever we call them, in which, for instance, civil society would be able to alert governments when there are standard proposals with human rights implications, that would help everyone follow a bit more closely the work. Nothing else from me, but scrolling down to see if there's anything else in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarina. Actually, there was a very interesting question about the participation of civil society more specifically. Ginger, would like to bring that in?
Sorry, I was looking for my unmute button. There is actually quite a good discussion going on, started by Junior, and then Cedric has brought in both areas and unheard voices like Bevel. So I know I'm going to mix comments, but I think you're referring to Cedric's point that he'd say it's not only from voices being unheard, but rather from some organizations being more state-driven, less accessible to civil society. And I know that Bevel did and Sarina both addressed that partially, but we did bring that on. And Saner, I'm going to apologize if I'm mangling your name, but Saner has said, talking about participation in standard setting organizations, what are the panelists' view about the ITU's hesitation to make accreditation of NGOs so difficult that even though some have full ECOSOC accreditation, they're apparently not getting ITU. Without better NGO participation, important stakeholders to ITU events are excluded, making ITU less inclusive than necessary. And so what are your voices on this? This is from Raymond.
Thank you very much. A very, very good question, Raymond. Perhaps, Bevel, would you like to start by reflecting on Raymond's question, and then I can turn to Serena?
I'll reflect on it by asking my colleague, Junior McIntyre from the Caribbean Telecommunications Union to reflect on it, because it's one of the things here that we can't escape is that the world is changing, and some of these bodies were formed in a different era and time and context, and it's difficult to change to reflect the broader participation or the expectation that it would be easier to participate for a more diverse group than might have been contemplated in the, I think the ITU is over 100 years old, for example, in the time of its formation. And part of what I think we're witnessing across the standards making arena is that different groups are forming as a response or as a reaction to the under exclusivity in some of the more traditional sectors. Now, that is not necessarily a good thing when it comes to a comprehensive or coherent approach to standards making, but it may be a necessary thing to trigger the kind of evolution of thought and change that we need to see. ITU has been largely biased toward public sector government representation. And the actors that now have a larger say in the telecommunications and technology arena are private sector. Where do they go and what do they do when they want to contribute to how things get defined? That's a question that has to be answered, and I know if we have any of the ITU representatives on the call, they can talk about how long and how hard a battle that has been to shift things to accommodate it. But I don't think it's peculiar to the ITU. I think we can see that in the ITF, for example, where, again, a traditional group has been accustomed to sitting down and hammering out standards in a particular way. And as participation broadens and things have to change to embrace and accept these new voices, there will be pushback. We have seen, as I said, with the regional internet registries, the evolution. LACNIC had to introduce a budget to deal with translation, to incorporate the contributions of the English-speaking Caribbean members of LACNIC. ARIN had to invest in outreach to the Caribbean to compensate for a lack of presence in what would be a significant portion of its service region. And these are decisions that have to be taken, and they take time to execute perfectly. So it is a valid point, but it is one of the areas where we can expect to see more tension and possibly even contention as we go forward, as groups try to have their voices heard. And in some cases, as they accept invitations that aren't fully thought out to come and participate, when they show up and find that the systems and structures still aren't accommodating. So that kind of evolution, I think, is something that we can only expect to see more of, which is why these kinds of reports and these kinds of surveys and research become so important to informing how we evolve going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think this tension is necessarily a bad thing. I remember after the Snowden revelations, I had colleagues that had worked with human rights for their whole life that started to participate much more in the IETF to try to reinforce human rights from the perspective of standards. And the technical community, some members at the beginning, they were a little bit, don't come here, don't politicize the issue. We're here discussing technical issues. And there was some pushback, but after some time, one side understood the other and they work together very well now. So it's a good tension, I suppose. Serena, over to you. Perhaps, I know you have some reflections on what recently happened, the World Telecommunications Standardization Assembly. Perhaps you could bring in some outcomes of this discussion if they're relevant to what we're discussing here to enhance participation. You mentioned 2 resolutions, for example. So what can we expect looking forward, Serena?
Thanks, Marilia. I did have a few slides looking at some of the outcomes of the WTSA. I'm not sure if we still have time for that. Should I try or should I just... let me see.
We are close to finishing the event, so maybe you can have your own very quick tweets.
Let me see, at least to show what I have, and then we can share the slides with the people who are here in the call. And I hope you can see my screen, which I'm trying to make a bit bigger now. Okay, excellent. So yes, there was this World Telecom Standardization Assembly happening in Geneva for like 9 or 10 days. And I tried to look a bit at what were some of the key outcomes. And what I think was mostly interesting was not necessarily what was approved, but what was not approved. And this relates a bit to the earlier question about expanding mandates of some organizations or not. But going quickly through what was approved, there were decisions on the new work program for the new study period, something that's happening now. So basically what the ITUT will be focusing on in terms of developing standards. One of the most controversial issues, as everyone can imagine, was around leadership for study groups for obvious reasons. And there were some modifications to some of the ITUT resolutions dealing with issues like cybersecurity, spam, IPv6 transition, climate change, and a few other things. I have gone through all these resolutions. The changes, I wouldn't say they are substantive or significant. But if anyone is interested, there is this outcome document published by the ITU, which is showing the resolutions which have been changed. So in terms of work program, the slides, as you will go through them after the event, are basically looking at what has been added in terms of focus areas for the study groups. And some of the additions are quite interesting. I'll just give a few examples. For example, in study group 3, there is this very specific reference now on the role of the group in studying the economic and regulatory impact of new and emerging technologies without really defining what this means. So it will be interesting to see what comes out of the group. Then in SG9 on audiovisual content, there are clear references to studies, which can mean basically everything about virtual reality and augmented reality, and also a bit of work around artificial intelligence. Let me move next. In study group 13 on future network and emerging network technologies, there is now a very clear reference on work being done on developing standards for quantum key distribution networks, which is not necessarily new because ITUT has been developing standards on quantum in the previous study period as well, but it was not specifically mentioned in the focus area of the study group. So now there is a clear mandate for work around these issues. And I'll scroll quickly through all this because we don't have time. There were also a few study groups with no really changes. Again, what was interesting was the discussion behind closed doors around study group leaderships. For those who do not know, there are 11 study groups at ITUT. Each of them has one chair and quite a lot of vice chairs. The idea with vice chairs is to ensure some sort of regional balance or at least diversity. What we did was to look at to make a sort of a comparison between the distribution of chair and vice chair for the previous study period, which was 2017-2020, but continuing till this year because of the WTSA being postponed. And as I'm hoping you can see on the slide, there were quite a lot of variety in terms of both developed and developing countries having stakeholders in this position, with China being at the top. And in the new study period, we have again China at the top, but we do have more countries with stakeholders in leadership positions. I think the comparison is between 31 in the previous study period and 41 or 42 countries in the current study period. So some 10 new countries with chair or vice chair positions. And surprising to me was to see India at the top. In the previous study period, they had no chair or vice chair. Now they are the third in line. So that's quite interesting. And as you might expect, there was quite a lot of controversy around candidates from the Russian Federation. And that led to something that hasn't happened at ITUT for quite a while, and that has been voting. So there was an instance of voting of the full list of proposals. More details here. There are some examples of modifications to resolutions. I'll skip that. You can go through them. And as I was saying, what I think was mostly interesting was the part that was not approved. And one example was this proposal for a new resolution on artificial intelligence, which have been instructing, among others, ITUT to develop some sort of a framework of ethical principles on AI, which, again, it's not really probably within the ITU mandates, but everyone is developing these days this kind of framework. So you might say, why not one more organization? But there was no consensus on this, so the resolution was not approved. There was another resolution on open access networks that would have strengthened standardization activities on these issues that was not approved either. And what was quite interesting from the perspective of diversifying participation in ITU was a series of proposals to change a resolution on industry engagement, which would have seen a bit more involvement of the private sector in study group, including leadership positions and a more active role. Unfortunately, this was not approved either, and the private sector made it very clear at the end that it becomes increasingly difficult for them to motivate their participation in ITUT if it is governments who are more involved, and they seem to be the more equal actors among partners or equal actors out there. And I think I stop here and go back to Marilia while I stop the share screening.
Thank you very much, Serena. I know that you were under pressure of time, but you have such a rich slides. But even if you went through them quickly, that gives us a little bit more context, because we're going to receive the slides, and I'm sure that we'll be able to understand the information now. I know that we are on the top of the hour. Baba, would you like to have some final words?
Okay, thank you. Sure. Just want to encourage Diplo to continue this great work. The internet registries, ARIN in particular, not only applauds it, but fully supports it. And we're really looking forward to taking this forward and using the insights that the report has provided to educate our own and sensitize our own community about the importance of participation in the standards making process. I think this is exceptional. The upcoming ARIN meeting is scheduled for April. That's ARIN 49, and this will be part of our report to the community then. So for those who are interested in participating in the standards process and making process, this is an event that will give you a good indication of how your voice can be heard. And it's a tangible way, I think, of also demonstrating the value of what this report is pointing to in terms of some of the recommendations and approaches. So congrats, and looking forward to seeing where this report takes us all in terms of building greater stakeholder awareness and hopefully also widening participation in the standards making process.
Thank you, Bevel. Thank you, Serena. I think that we advanced some very good, concrete suggestions. It was a very constructive discussion. Thank you to all our participants who joined us, who asked questions, for being with us today. Thank you, Ginger, for following the chat. And we hope to continue this conversation with everyone soon in the next event. Thank you very much. Have a good continuation of the day. Thank you.
Recording stopped.